Hey, my name is Caleb Foster. I'm 29 years old and I work in the mailroom of a mid-sized event planning company called Hartwell & Cole Creative, tucked into the fourth floor of an old brick building in downtown Denver. I sort packages, refill the printer paper nobody else remembers to refill, fix the copier when it jams at the worst possible moment, and carry boxes of centerpiece flowers up 3 flights of stairs when the freight elevator breaks, which is more often than you'd think. Most people in that building don't know my last name. Some don't know I have a name at all. I'm the guy with the cart. I'm fine with that. I never wanted to be the center of anything. I just wanted a steady paycheck and a quiet life. And for 3 years, that's exactly what I had, until the day I watched 200 people in their best clothes turn into a room full of wolves, and I found myself walking down a church aisle toward a woman I had no right to be walking toward. But to understand why I did that, you have to go back 4 months, to the day Nora Whitfield spilled an iced coffee on my shoes and apologized like I was the most important person in the building. I'd seen her around before that, obviously. You don't work in the same office as someone for 2 years without noticing them, especially when that someone runs every event the company puts on with the kind of calm precision that makes everyone else look like they're improvising. Nora was the lead coordinator. She managed seating charts for 400 guests without breaking a sweat, negotiated with caterers who tried to overcharge her, and somehow remembered the names of every vendor's assistant's dog. She was sharp in the way that didn't need to announce itself. She didn't walk into a room and demand attention. She just made everything around her work better, quietly, the way good plumbing does. I'd liked her for a while before that coffee spilled. Not in some dramatic way, just in the way you like sunlight on a cold morning, something you don't think about until it's gone. That Tuesday, she came around the corner too fast, balancing a coffee tray and a stack of folders, and the whole thing tipped sideways right onto my shoes and the cart I was pushing. I expected her to apologize the way busy people usually do, fast, distracted, already moving on to the next thing. Instead, she crouched down right there in the hallway and started wiping my shoes with a napkin from her pocket. "Caleb, I am so sorry," she said, and she said my name like she'd used it before, which surprised me because I didn't think she knew it. "You don't have to do that," I told her. "It's just coffee." She looked up at me, still crouched on the floor in her heels and her blazer, and said, "It's not just coffee. It's coffee on a person who already does enough cleaning up after the rest of us." That sentence stayed with me for weeks. After that, she started saying hello in the hallway. Not the kind of hello people give out of obligation, but the kind where she actually stopped walking. She started leaving extra pastries from client meetings on my desk in the mailroom with sticky notes that said things like, "You looked tired yesterday, eat something." I told myself it didn't mean anything. She was just one of those people who was kind to everyone. The receptionist, the janitor, the new interns who cried in the break room during their first week. But there was a version of her that only showed up in small moments, when she thought no one was paying attention, and I was always paying attention. Then I found out she was engaged. Derek Cole, the son of one of the firm's founding partners, the Cole half of Hartwell & Cole. He worked 2 floors up in an office with actual windows and a view of the mountains, doing something with client acquisitions that none of us in the mailroom fully understood, but that apparently paid enough for the watch he wore. Derek was handsome in the kind of way that photographed well, charming in the kind of way that made older clients trust him instantly, and absent in the kind of way nobody in the office seemed to talk about out loud. I watched them together exactly twice before the wedding, both times in the lobby, both times brief. He'd kiss her cheek, check his phone, tell her he had a call, and leave. She always smiled when he did it, but the smile never quite reached the way it did when she talked about table arrangements or color palettes or the small thoughtful things she noticed in other people. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself a lot of things that fall apart pretty fast around someone you've started caring about more than you meant to. The wedding invitation showed up in the office mail 4 months later, cream-colored envelopes addressed to every department, including, to my genuine shock, mine. I almost threw it away without opening it, assuming it had been misdelivered. But my name was right there in her handwriting, careful and looping. "Caleb, I'd really love it if you came. You make this place feel less like a machine." I read that line probably 20 times before I folded the card and put it in my desk drawer. Nobody wants to watch someone they've quietly started falling for marry someone else. But I also knew what it would mean to her if the one genuine person in that office didn't show up. So I bought a navy suit from the discount rack at a department store outside the city. The kind of suit a guy like me could actually afford. And I drove out to St. Foss, Catherine's Chapel on a bright Saturday morning in October with absolutely no idea that I was about to become part of the story instead of just a witness to it. The chapel was beautiful, all white stone and tall windows, the kind of place that smelled like lilies and old wood. I sat in the back, the way I always do, somewhere between the photographer's assistant and a cluster of Derek's college friends who were loudly comparing golf scores before the ceremony even started. Nora walked down the aisle in a dress that looked like something out of an old photograph. Simple and elegant, her father's arm steady under hers. She looked happy. She looked nervous in the normal way brides look nervous. I remember thinking, even with everything twisting inside my chest, that I was glad she looked happy, because that was supposed to be enough. Then we waited. The minister kept glancing toward the side door. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. The string quartet had run out of songs to repeat and started awkwardly improvising. Guests started murmuring, checking their phones, exchanging looks. I watched Nora's hands, still holding her bouquet, start to tremble slightly, though her face stayed composed, the way I imagined she stayed composed through every crisis at every event she'd ever run. At 35 minutes, her maid of honor, a woman named Jenna who I recognized from the office Christmas party, hurried up the side aisle with her phone glowing in her hand. She showed it to Nora without a word. I watched Nora's face change, not dramatically, just a slow draining of color, like watching a light dim instead of switch off. Later I learned what the message said. 3 words. "I can't, sorry." 5 years together, 200 guests. Ended with 3 words sent from a phone while she stood at the altar in her mother's veil. Then someone near the front, an older man I didn't recognize, laughed. A short, ugly bark of a sound, and muttered something to the woman beside him about brides who get what they deserve. A ripple of cruel amusement moved through the room, phones quietly rising to record, somebody's voice carrying just loud enough to hear, "Well, that's one way to find out what he really thinks of her." I felt something in my chest go hot and then very cold. I thought about every time Nora had stopped in a hallway to ask if I'd eaten, every pastry left on my desk with a kind note, every time she'd made me, the mailroom guy nobody noticed, feel like I existed. And here was a room full of people who had RSVP'd to celebrate her, now treating the worst moment of her life like entertainment. I don't fully remember deciding to stand up. I remember the sound of my own chair scraping against stone, loud in a suddenly very quiet room, and I remember 200 heads turning to look at the guy in the discount suit walking up the center aisle like he had every right to be there. Nora saw me coming before anyone said a word. Her eyes were wide, red-rimmed, disbelieving. "Caleb," she whispered when I reached the altar steps, "what are you doing?" I kept my voice low enough that it was only for her. "I don't know exactly," I said, "but I wasn't going to sit back there and watch this happen to you alone." The minister, completely thrown, asked who I was. "I'm a friend of the bride," I said, and then, because the words were already rising in my throat before I could stop them, "and I'm not going to let her stand here and be humiliated in front of people who don't deserve to witness anything about her life." A ripple of shocked whispering swept the chapel. Derek's mother stood up somewhere near the front, sputtering something about how inappropriate this was. Nora looked at me like she was trying to read a language she'd never been taught. "Caleb," she said again, quieter this time, "you don't have to do this." I looked her directly in the eyes. "I know I don't have to," I said. "I want to. If you want me to walk away right now, say the word, and I'll go sit back down and nobody will ever bring this up again. But if you don't want to walk out of here alone in front of all these people who were just laughing at you, I'm right here." She looked out over the room, at the laughing faces now gone awkward and uncertain, at her mother crying quietly in the front pew, at her father's jaw locked tight with fury he didn't know where to aim. Then she looked back at me, and something in her expression shifted from shock into something steadier. "Are you serious?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," I told her, and I meant it more than I'd meant almost anything before. Her father, a broad-shouldered man named Walter who I'd later learn had spent 30 years running a construction company before he retired, stood up from the front pew. He looked at the empty space where Derek should have been standing, then at me, an ordinary guy in an off-the-rack suit who had just done something nobody else in that building full of important people had the nerve to do. "If my daughter wants this," he said, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent chapel, "then I'm not going to stand in the way." Nora reached for my hand. Her fingers were ice-cold and shaking, but she didn't let go once she found mine. "Yes," she told the minister, her voice cracking but clear enough for the whole room to hear. "I want to continue." The minister explained, understandably rattled, that he couldn't perform a legally binding ceremony with the wrong groom standing at the altar, that the license had Derek's name on it, that any real marriage would have to wait for paperwork, but he could do a commitment ceremony, a public promise made in front of family and witnesses, with the legal part to follow later if we chose. When it came time for vows, I didn't reach for anything rehearsed or romantic. I looked at Nora and said the only thing that felt honest in that moment. "I promise I will never let anyone make your pain into their entertainment again," I told her. "I promise to see you the way I've seen you for months, even on days when you don't think anyone's watching. I promise I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes filled, but this time the tears weren't only grief. "I promise I'll remember that you were the one who stood up," she said, when nobody else in this room had the courage to. When the minister finished and pronounced us joined in promise if not yet in law, the chapel stayed silent for a long, strange moment before the applause started. Hesitant at first, scattered, then slowly growing as people who'd been ready to laugh at her 10 minutes earlier scrambled to look like they'd been moved all along. Our first kiss was barely a kiss at all. Just the briefest press of lips, careful and respectful rather than romantic. But when we walked back down that aisle together, hand in hand, I felt her stop shaking quite so hard. And for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, I didn't feel invisible at all. The reception that followed felt like a play where half the actors had forgotten their lines. The banner above the head table still read Nora and Derek in gold cursive. The cake still had 2 intertwined initials that weren't mine. I heard the whispers as we moved through the room. A cousin of Derek's muttering that this had probably been planned, someone else suggesting she'd swapped grooms out of spite. I started to turn toward them, but Nora's hand tightened around mine. "Don't," she murmured. "Today's already been loud enough." So I stayed quiet and did what needed doing instead. I refilled her water glass when I noticed she hadn't touched it in an hour. I helped lift the hem of her dress when it caught under a chair leg. When people asked how long we'd secretly been together, I told them the truth. Long enough to know she didn't deserve what happened to her today, which usually ended the conversation fast. Her mother pulled her aside near the gift table at one point, and though I couldn't hear the words, I watched Nora's shoulders shake as she cried into her mother's shoulder, and when they separated, her mother glanced across the room at me with an expression that wasn't warm exactly, but wasn't hostile anymore either. Later, her father found me near the bar, a glass of water in his rough hands. "Do you love my daughter?" he asked. No preamble, no small talk. Lying would have been easy and would have cost nothing. But Nora had already been lied to once that day by someone who'd promised her forever. I wasn't going to be the second man to do it. "I don't know if I have the right to call it love yet," I told him honestly. "But I respect her more than almost anyone I've ever met, and I wasn't going to watch her get humiliated by a room full of people who don't know the first thing about who she really is." Walter studied me for a long moment, then gave a single slow nod. "At least you're not a liar," he said, which felt like the highest compliment a man like him was capable of giving a stranger in a borrowed suit. The apartment she and Derek had been planning to share was suddenly an impossible place to walk into. Her parents' house was already full of confused, exhausted relatives asking questions she didn't have the energy to answer. My apartment was small and unimpressive, but it was quiet, and more than anything else that night, it was safe. "You can stay at my place tonight," I told her in the parking lot as she stood there still wearing her wedding dress under a borrowed coat. "I'll take the couch, you take the bed, we'll figure the rest out tomorrow." She looked at me, completely drained. "Are you sure?" she asked. "My apartment isn't fancy," I warned her. "It's warm," was all she said, and something about those two words made the tightness in my chest ease for the first time all day. My building was old, 3 flights up with no elevator and a hallway light that had been flickering for months despite my complaints to the landlord. When I opened my door and she stepped inside, I felt a wave of embarrassment looking at my place through her eyes, the second-hand couch, the small dining table with a stack of unpaid bills on it, the project folders I'd brought home from the mailroom that had no business sitting on a kitchen counter. This was not the kind of apartment you brought a bride home to. But Nora looked around slowly, taking in the small space, and said quietly, "It's warm," again, like she meant something deeper by it the second time. I gave her one of my clean t-shirts and a pair of sweatpants, and pointed her toward the bathroom. When she came out, the wedding dress was gone, replaced by oversized cotton that swallowed her completely. No careful makeup left, no styled hair, just Nora. Small and tired and more real than I'd ever seen her look in any hallway at the office. I made tea because it was the only thing I knew how to offer, and we sat across from each other at my small table while the city hummed faintly outside the window. "Caleb," she said eventually, "I need you to understand something. I did what I did today because I thought it was the right thing," I told her, "not because you owe me anything." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Everyone thinks we're married now," she said. "I know," I answered. "The videos are probably already online. I know that too. People at the office are going to ask questions." "I know," I said again, and she let out a small, exhausted laugh despite everything. "We have options," I told her. "Tomorrow we can tell everyone it was just a gesture to get you out of a humiliating moment. Or we can let the story keep going until things settle down on their own." Or, I hesitated, "Or what?" she asked. "Or we actually try to get to know each other for real," I said. "Not out of obligation, not out of gratitude, just two people in a strange situation seeing if there's something here worth building." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought I'd said too much. Then she asked, "What do you want, Caleb?" Nobody had asked me that question in longer than I could remember. "I want to make sure you're okay," I told her honestly. "And I want to know you outside of the office, outside of today, outside of being the woman who got left standing at an altar." Her eyes glistened. "I don't know if I can trust anyone right now," she admitted. "Then don't trust me yet," I said. "Just don't make any big decisions tonight." That night I slept on the couch, staring at the same water-stained ceiling I'd been staring at for 3 years, fully aware that I had just stepped into a story I never planned for. I should have felt terrified. Instead, all I felt was one clear, quiet certainty. I didn't regret standing up, not even a little. The weeks that followed turned into something neither of us had a name for yet. Footage from the chapel had already spread online by Monday morning, and the office buzzed with the kind of attention I'd spent 3 years successfully avoiding. Some coworkers called me brave. A few muttered that I'd just been waiting for my opportunity, that I'd taken advantage of a woman in shock. Derek's father, the Cole half of the company, called Nora and me both into his office that week, and I genuinely thought I was about to lose the only job I had. Instead, Nora walked in with her spine straight and her voice level. "We'll keep our private lives outside these walls," she told him calmly. "Caleb doesn't want special treatment, and neither do I. I just want to keep doing my work." I nodded along, adding only, "I'm still the same guy with the mail cart, that's all this is." In the staff meeting later that day, Nora addressed the room directly before anyone could whisper behind her back. "I know everyone has questions," she said, standing at the front like she was presenting a client proposal instead of defending her own life. "But my personal life isn't an agenda item. If anyone has actual work questions, I'm happy to answer those." The room went quiet, and I watched something settle into place in her that I don't think had been there before. Not just composure, something closer to ownership of her own story. She stayed at my apartment longer than either of us had planned for. At first, everything was careful and deliberate, like two roommates negotiating shared space for the first time. I slept on the couch, she took the bedroom. We worked out an unspoken schedule for the bathroom. I bought a cheap reading lamp because she mentioned that total darkness made it hard for her to fall asleep. Small things started appearing between us without either of us naming them. She left notes on my fridge. There's a sandwich in the blue container. Don't skip lunch again. The same kind of notes she used to leave on my mailroom desk, except now they felt like something closer to home than charity. I started making her tea every night without being asked. Neither of us called it taking care of each other, but we both knew exactly what it was. We started having real conversations, the kind you don't have time for in a hallway between meetings. She told me about her grandmother, who'd taught her that a woman's dignity was never something you could buy, no matter how much money tried to convince you otherwise. I told her about my mother, who'd worked double shifts at a diner for years after my father left when I was 9. And how I grew up believing that the people who actually show up for you matter more than the people who talk a good game about commitment. Derek always wanted to look like a winner, Nora said quietly one evening, staring into her tea. Big house, fast career, the right photos for the right people. But the one time it actually mattered for him to show up, he sent 3 words from somewhere I'll never even know. I didn't say anything. I just added a little more honey to her cup and let the silence sit there. One night about 3 weeks in, I came home late from a delivery run and found her asleep at my kitchen table, head resting on a stack of vendor contracts she'd brought home from work, hair falling loose across her face. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, something quiet and a little frightening unfolding in my chest. The kind of feeling you can't really name because naming it makes it real. I didn't wake her right away. I just watched, and somewhere in that stillness I understood that whatever this had started as, it had stopped being a gesture a long time ago. About a month after the chapel, Nora and I sat on my couch on a rainy Friday night with cheap takeout containers between us, and she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, careful, searching. "Caleb," she said, "can I ask you something honest?" "Always," I told her. "Why did you really stand up that day?" she asked. "Was it because you felt sorry for me, or was it something else?" I set down my fork and thought about lying my way around it, softening it into something easier to hear. Then I decided she deserved better than that. "I'd been quietly falling for you for months before that wedding," I admitted. "Watching you stop in hallways to check on people nobody else noticed. Watching you remember things about strangers that most people forget about their own friends. I told myself it wasn't my place to feel anything, because you were engaged, because I was the guy with the mail cart and you ran the whole building practically by yourself. But when I watched that room start laughing at you, I wasn't thinking about being noble. I was thinking that I couldn't sit there and do nothing while people treated the kindest person I knew like a joke." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she reached across the space between us and laced her fingers through mine, the same way she had at the altar, except this time there was no fear in it, just steadiness. "I used to think I'd marry someone who looked perfect on paper," she said quietly. "Derek looked perfect on paper. And then on the one day it actually counted, paper didn't mean anything at all. I think I'd rather have someone who shows up than someone who looks good standing still." I leaned my forehead against hers, not quite a kiss, just close enough to feel her breath. "I'm not going anywhere," I told her. And for the first time since the chapel, I watched her fully believe it. 3 months after the wedding that wasn't a wedding, Derek came back. He showed up at the office on a Thursday afternoon in an expensive overcoat. The same polished smile that never reached his eyes, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't ended 5 years of someone's life with 3 words sent from a phone. I saw him before Nora did, talking to the receptionist like he still owned the place. "I need to see Nora," he said when he spotted me. "She's not yours to see anymore," I told him, my voice steadier than I expected. He looked me up and down with open contempt. "Ah," he said, "the mailroom hero. You actually think this is real? She married you out of shock, out of humiliation. You're a rebound with a delivery cart." I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I'd learned that men like Derek wanted exactly that. Proof that they could still get under someone's skin. Nora stepped out of a conference room at that exact moment and froze when she saw him. For 1 second her face went pale, then she pulled herself together in front of my eyes, the same way she'd done in that chapel. "What do you want, Derek?" she asked, her voice flat. He launched into an explanation he'd clearly rehearsed, that he'd panicked, that the wedding had felt too big too fast, that seeing her stand up for herself with someone else had made him realize he'd made a mistake. Nora let him finish before she laughed, short and bitter. "You realize that after I stopped waiting alone at an altar for you," she said. He glanced at me. "He's not right for you, Nora. He's just some guy from the mailroom. You've always deserved more than that." Something old and familiar twisted in my chest, the echo of every time in my life someone had decided what I deserved before I'd even opened my mouth. But Nora stepped closer to me, not away, and the motion settled something in me I hadn't known was still unsettled. "Caleb is right for me because he stayed," she said, her voice carrying clearly down the hallway. "You might have the better suit and the bigger paycheck, but on the worst day of my life, you disappeared." He stood up. "That tells me everything I need to know." Derek's expression cracked, just slightly, the polish slipping. When men like him get cornered, they don't apologize, they attack, and he told the truth in the cruelest way he could manage. He hadn't just panicked at the altar. The night before the wedding, an investor's daughter named Vanessa had given him an ultimatum: marry Nora and lose access to her father's capital, or walk away and step straight into a partnership that would set him up for life. He'd chosen the partnership, chosen the money, chosen the easier door, and hadn't had the spine to say any of it to her face, just 3 words typed into a phone while she stood waiting in white. Nora went very still when she heard the full story, not because she still loved him, but because she finally understood exactly how she'd been weighed and measured like an asset on a balance sheet. "So I wasn't valuable enough for your future," she said quietly. "I didn't say that," Derek answered, already backpedaling. "No," she said, "you said exactly that. You just used more words this time." He didn't leave quietly. Over the following weeks he took the story to social media, claiming I'd manipulated a vulnerable woman, and for a few days it worked exactly the way cruelty usually does, fast and loud. Nora tried to stay strong in front of me, but I caught her reading comments late at night, her face lit by the cold glow of her phone in the dark living room. One night I found her sitting on the fire escape outside my window in nothing but a thin sweater, knees pulled to her chest. "Am I dragging you into more trouble than you signed up for?" she asked without looking at me. I sat down beside her in the cold. "You could have had a quieter life if you hadn't agreed to any of this," she added. "I already had a quiet life before that day," I told her. "It was peaceful. It just didn't have you in it." She started crying then, the kind of crying that had clearly been waiting weeks to come out. I took her hand. "Derek doesn't get to decide the rest of your story," I said. "Neither do the people online, neither does his family, and honestly, neither do I. Only you get to decide where you want to be." "What if I choose you?" she whispered. "Then I choose you back," I told her. "Every single day, not because of that chapel, not out of pity, because of you." She leaned her head against my shoulder and finally let herself stop performing strength for one night, and that, more than anything that came before it, felt like the real beginning of something that had nothing left to prove to anyone. The next morning she posted something simple. No long explanation, no defense of either of us. She wrote that her wedding day had started in chaos, but that her life with me hadn't been a reaction to abandonment. It had become a choice, made with open eyes, and that she no longer needed anyone's permission to feel grateful for the person who'd actually shown up. The last line stuck with people. "The man who left didn't get to define me. The man who stayed doesn't own me either. I choose this because it respects me." Some people still doubted it, most didn't. Derek made one more half-hearted attempt at contact, then quietly disappeared from both our lives, the way people like him eventually do once the audience stops paying attention. We kept living, not perfectly, but honestly. Nora got promoted to senior coordinator and started bringing in clients on her own reputation instead of the firm's name. I started taking night classes in logistics management, not to prove anything to anyone, just because for the first time in years I wanted to build towards something instead of just getting by. One evening, almost a year after the chapel, we were eating noodles standing up in my kitchen because the table was covered in her seating charts, and she looked at me and said, "I love you." I nearly dropped my fork. "Not because you stood up that day," she added quickly, laughing through sudden tears. "Not because I'm grateful. I love you because you make tea without me asking, because you remember which of my coworkers to avoid talking about, because you never once made me feel like I owed you anything for loving me." I crossed the kitchen and pulled her into my arms right there among the takeout containers. "I love you too," I told her, and I think I have since, long before either of us was ready to admit it. A year and a half after the day a stranger in a discount suit walked down a church aisle, Nora looked at me over coffee one Sunday morning and said, "I want to marry you again." I set my mug down carefully. "We're already married, sort of," I reminded her, smiling. "I know," she said, "but the first time was about surviving the worst day of my life. This time I want to do it because I'm choosing you, in front of the people who actually love us, not the ones who showed up to watch a spectacle." "Are you proposing to me?" I asked. Her smile was small and certain. "Maybe," she said. "Then I accept," I told her. The second wedding looked nothing like the first. 40 people gathered in her parents' backyard on a warm afternoon. White string lights threaded through the trees, her mother's garden roses in simple jars on every table instead of towering floral arrangements. Walter walked her down a short grass aisle and placed her hand in mine. "Last time you stood up for my girl," he said quietly. "This time, stay." "I planned to," I told him, and I meant it completely. Nora wore a simpler dress this time, the kind she said she could actually breathe in, and I wore the same navy suit from the chapel, taken in slightly at the shoulders because some things deserve to stay exactly as they were when they mattered most. When it came time for vows, I went first. "The first time I made promises to you, I barely understood what I was doing," I said. "I only knew you didn't deserve to be left standing alone. Today I know exactly what I'm doing. I choose you, not out of pity, not because of one impulsive moment in a chapel, but because you're the person who taught an ordinary guy with a mail cart that showing up is its own kind of love." Her eyes filled before I'd even finished. "The first time I said yes to you, it was because I needed somewhere safe to stand," she said. "Today I say yes because I found a home. You didn't rescue me by making me feel small, Caleb. You saved me by reminding me I was always worth staying for." We kissed under the string lights to real applause this time, warm and unguarded. No confusion, no pity, just people who'd watched two ordinary lives quietly become something extraordinary. 3 years after that first chapel, I came home from work to find Nora sitting at our kitchen table. The same kind of table I'd once been embarrassed to have her see, except now it held a small white stick with 2 pink lines instead of unpaid bills. I didn't say anything. I just crossed the room, pulled her into my arms, and held on. Because some moments don't need words, just presence. We named our daughter June, because Nora said it was the month she finally stopped being afraid to want something for herself. 5 years after a room full of strangers laughed while a man's 3-word text destroyed someone's wedding day, I picked June up from daycare on a Tuesday afternoon while Nora finished a client call. June ran toward me yelling "Daddy" at the top of her lungs, and I scooped her up and felt her arms wrap tight around my neck the way they always did, like the world made complete sense from right there. Later that night, after June had fallen asleep clutching her stuffed rabbit, Nora curled into my side on our worn second-hand couch, the same couch from my old apartment that we'd refused to replace because, as she put it, some things had earned their place in our lives. I thought about that chapel sometimes, about the version of me who almost stayed seated, who almost let 200 strangers decide what kind of moment that day was allowed to become. If I could go back, I would still stand up, I would still walk past every laughing face in that room. I would still look at a shaking bride in white and say, "I'm right here." Because sometimes a whole life doesn't change because of some perfect plan you've been building toward for years. Sometimes it changes because in someone else's very worst moment, an ordinary person nobody usually notices decides to stand up anyway, and if you're patient enough, and honest enough, and brave enough to stay long after the applause has faded, that single decision can quietly become an entire life.